It's just preparing. Takes a little while. Preparing. Wow. Whoops. Okay. So I am going to mute and start the webinar. So if you could count back from 10 in your heads, that would be super.
Great, so let's make a start. Welcome everyone to the launch of our new report called Unequal Britain, Attitudes to Inequalities After COVID-19. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and this study is one we've done with our excellent colleagues at UK and a Changing Europe. And as part of our work looking at attitudes to inequalities for the IFS Deaton Review, supported by the Nuffield Foundation. Before we start, I want to thank all involved in the study, particularly the authors of the report, Kirsty Hewlett, Rachel Hesketh, Rebecca Benson, and Alan Wager, and George Merkin for his editing and design work on it. And we have a brilliant panel for you today to talk through the findings and what they might mean for both policy and politics. First up, we'll have Paula Surridge, who is Deputy Director of UK and Changing Europe and a Senior Lecturer at the University of Bristol. Then we'll have Paul Johnson, who's Director of the IFS and leading the Deaton Review, obviously with Angus Deaton alongside him. And finally, we'll have Sundar Katwala, who is Director of British Future. Before we hear from the panel, and then we will have time for questions from you, I just want to give you a quick overview, try and do this in around 12 minutes of some of the key findings to set the context for the study. I'm just going to share my screen in order to do that. I have to say there's a lot more in the report than I'm going to show you here, but I'm going to just try to do 6 key points in the next 12 minutes or so. And the first one, the most obvious one in some ways, is that from the study overall, is that area-based inequality is really high up our list of priorities in Britain. And then secondly, that it's unusually unifying. So when you ask people, which 3 or 4 of the following types of inequality do you think are most serious for Britain? This is the priority order that you get, with inequalities between more and less deprived areas, right at the top of the list, alongside income and wealth. And then there's a bit of a step down to inequalities between racial or ethnic groups and alongside educational outcomes for children. Then another step down to inequalities between men and women, and on health and life expectancies, and between older and younger generations. Maybe surprising health and life expectancies so low down during a health-based pandemic. But it does point to the fact that levelling up has widespread appeal to the public just on this simple question. And then there is that second point, that it is also quite a unifying type of inequality, that a unifying level of concern across different groups. We looked at different geographies, different demographic groups, and pretty much across all, including by political party, inequalities between more and less deprived areas were at or near the top, and very consistent between Labour and Conservative on here. Much more consistent than inequalities between income and wealth, where Labour supporters more concerned than Conservative supporters. And then we have a very big gap on inequalities between racial or ethnic groups, with Labour supporters twice as likely to say that that's a serious issue for Britain than Conservative supporters. And some of this divergence, some of the difference between different groups on some elements of inequalities will be related to whether we think, partially related to whether we think inequalities are structural or down to the individual, which is one of the key dividing lines in this. And just picking up on racial inequalities as one of the themes within this, we look at it much more deeply in the report. We asked this question, which is asked much more commonly in the US than in Britain, but it was useful to test it in Britain too. So the question is, on average, Black people, we tell people that on average, Black people in Britain have lower earnings and are more likely to be unemployed than white people. And then we asked, do you think these differences are due to a range of different factors? And I'm just going to pick out a couple here. Firstly, because of discrimination, and this is actually the top answer that people give. Around half of people think it's because of discrimination, although 30% of people don't think it's because of discrimination. And then when you ask people whether it's because most Black people don't have motivation or willpower to pull themselves up and out of poverty, very few people agree. 66% of people say no, 2/3 of people say no, 13% of people say yes, but that is still 1 in 8 people who think it is related to willpower, Black people's motivation or willpower. And it's useful to compare this with the US, where we're very similar to the perceptions in the US on the importance of discrimination. But the US is much more likely to ascribe unequal outcomes for Black people to a lack of motivation or willpower than here, nearly 3 times as likely, 36% versus 13%. But one of the key points of the study is that these averages often hide huge range of views across different groups. And just picking out discrimination from that previous question, the percentage of people who say that unequal outcomes for Black people are because of discrimination, that overall average of around half of people hides this huge range of different views. And it's quite helpful, as we do quite a lot in the report, to interlock party support with leave or remain support. So it gives a richer view of difference between groups. And this runs a huge spectrum from 76% of Labour Remainers thinking these unequal outcomes are because of discrimination, down to 27% of Conservative Leavers who think it's because of discrimination. So quite different worldviews. But underlying that, it's important to recognise that there is a general belief in the importance of individual effort and meritocracy that does cut across different groups in Britain. There is a general belief in meritocracy. And you can see that in these types of questions. Ask people how important you think different factors are for getting ahead in life. And just about all people think that hard work and having ambition, very large proportions of people think that having hard work or ambition are important to get ahead in life. And that's across Conservative and Labour supporters, a bit higher among Conservatives, but still some of the top issues picked out, some of the top characteristics picked out by Labour supporters. But then there are very big differences between Conservative and Labour supporters on the more structural or background characteristic factors, with Labour supporters much more likely to think that it's also to do with knowing the right people, coming from a wealthy family, having the right political connections, and then background characteristic like a person's race or being born a man or a woman. And there was one very interesting question maybe a surprising question that shows some of that sense of the importance of merit, that we asked about people who'd lost their jobs or may lose their jobs during the pandemic, and how important people thought different factors are in explaining that. And these are the portions who say that luck has been important in determining whether people have lost or will lose their jobs. And you can see we're not very keen on believing in luck. Over half of people saying it's not very or not at all important in explaining current job losses. Whereas on the other hand, performance at work is seen as much more important. You've got around half of people saying that your performance at work has determined whether people have lost their jobs at this time, which seems to me quite a harsh view of job losses in an indiscriminate global pandemic, but does illustrate that view of personal responsibility. So we're also, and it may also be related to this fact that we're not yet expecting a big change in inequality post-COVID. Important to start with the view that people do think Britain is pretty unequal. You've got 6 in 10 people saying that it's very or somewhat unequal, and very few people thinking that it's even somewhat equal. But we're not expecting this to shift hugely. This is before the coronavirus outbreak, what people thought before that. When you ask about people what you think of being after the coronavirus outbreak, you can see the red bars are almost exactly, when you add them up, are almost exactly the same length. And what we're actually seeing is just an increase in the proportions of people who are saying very unequal. We shouldn't dismiss that, obviously. That's not a small thing, that 1/3 of people think Britain would be very unequal post the post the pandemic. But still, what we see when we look at more detailed responses to questions is that people tend to shift just one step. This is not something that people are thinking is going to be a sea change in people's levels of inequality. And then we also ask people whether they think more directly, whether they think the coronavirus crisis will increase or decrease the level of inequality compared to before the pandemic. And 44% of people said overall that they thought it would increase. But again, we see this huge range from 74% of Labour Remainers thinking it's going to increase, all the way down to 28% of Conservative Leavers. And one of the themes within the report is that Labour leavers often tend to be closer to Conservative voters on questions like some of the questions like this. There's a real mix of party support explaining differences between groups and Leave or Remain identity explaining differences between groups as one of the key themes of our time. So despite that kind of that strong sense of merit and not a great sense that things are going to get worse post the pandemic, not a very strong sense of that, current economic interventions are universally supported, particularly the furlough scheme. Maybe not surprisingly that hardly anyone objects to the furlough scheme. You've got 8 or 9 in 10 of people across Labour and Conservative and Leave Remain groups thinking that the government's furlough scheme is essential to protect people's livelihood. Very few people thinking that the government should not be doing this, should not be interfering in the economy, and the economy should just be left to adjust for itself. But again, even within this, there is a very wide variety of views, and we did quite a lot of experimental questions in this study as part of the Deaton review, where we'd ask people different types of framings of issues or questions, or in different types of ways to try to really unpick their views, whether fairness was important or whether thinking of things were right, or whether they were right or wrong were important. And one of those sets of questions that we asked was the same sets of questions about people's perceptions of the furlough scheme compared with unemployment benefits in more normal times. And that means that we can compare how people view the two different things and how that varies between groups. And I'll just talk you through this one. We asked people whether unemployment benefits and the furlough scheme encourages reliance on the state, and very distinctive views depending on what you're talking about and who you're looking at. So this is Conservative views of unemployment benefits, where 2/3 of Conservatives think that unemployment benefits encourages reliance on the state. This is Conservatives' views of the furlough scheme, that even with the furlough scheme as a one-off scheme, 35%, a third of Conservative voters view the furlough scheme as still encouraging reliance on the state, which is actually higher than the proportion of Labour supporters who think that unemployment benefits in normal times encourage reliance on the state, and hardly any Labour voters think that the furlough scheme itself is encouraging reliance on the state. So very different perspectives, again, on the importance and the impact of state intervention. So finally, despite those differences of views and that sense of meritocracy that cuts across all groups, there is still some space for discussing the government's role in tackling inequality among a section of the public. And again, it depends on how you present it. We did tests that looked at whether you talk at redistribution or whether you talk about taking measures to reduce differences in income levels, and whether different groups have different reactions to how you frame these different types of issues. And the overall picture is that there is this sense of a slightly open door to talk about the government's, whether the coronavirus crisis has meant that there's more role for government in tackling inequalities to some degree. And this question asks about whether there's more need for the government to take measures to reduce differences in income levels. And you see over half of people, 55% of people agree with this, and only small proportions of people disagreeing. And more importantly, in some ways, it's a pretty consistent view across the population. That includes 4 in 10 Conservatives who support that. That there is more of a need for the government to address differences in income levels, which suggests some opening up of a middle ground here for people to discuss actions on inequalities. So my very, very initial thoughts before we hear from the panel is that levelling up seems absolutely key from this. That was the thing that stood out when we first looked at the data, the surprise that priority level showed. It seems key, but this is just a very simple question, and understanding what people are thinking about when focused on area-based inequalities is going to be really key for the way forward. And that, whether this is about a rebalancing from north to south, or just the dominance of the London economy in Britain overall, or whether it's about much more local area and community levelling up. And I think looking across our data, there is evidence of both of those. But this is not just a simple north-south divide rebalancing. There's much more going on than that for people. This is obviously very clear, very early days in the impact of the pandemic, and that may shift. But it is hard to see that there's a general mood in the air, as Keir Starmer said in his speech on a new chapter from Britain. The overall impression you get from looking across all the different findings is it's more being a reinforcement of existing views in a quite divisive area. That focus on personal responsibility comes through very strongly, but it's, again, just a caveat on that is it's often a reluctant individualism on people, among people. It's not a belief that it's all working great for individuals. It is more the sense that for a proportion of that population that it is difficult to see alternatives rather than embracing rugged individualism. But as I say, finally, it does leave a slightly open door for discussion. But vital to understand that wide variety of starting points that people have, and we hope that this study has been a start in that, in order to not just find but also shape common ground on this very divisive and difficult issue. Thank you for that. So that's a very, very quick overview. It is much more in the report. Much more depth, and just a starting point of this discussion. So now it would be great to get views from the panel there, reactions to this. We're going to start with Paula.
Thank you. It's unusual for me in a webinar not to be the one presenting the slides. So looking at the data in the report and the slides that you've just presented for us, I think the first thing that really jumps out is the importance of the economics still when we're thinking about inequality and divisions in Britain. And I think this is a reflection of something that I've talked about a lot in the past, about how our politics is two-dimensional, and despite the kind of idea that we were becoming polarized across leave and remain identities, something I suspect Sunda might pick up on later, there is still this kind of cross-cutting divide as well that is important. It also, I think, shows us why the levelling up, the language of levelling up, kind of resonates across different groups, and why perhaps it was successful in amongst everything else that was being put forward at the 2019 election, because it did resonate with the kinds of divides that people think were important. But I wanted to pick up on the point you made at the end there, that it isn't clear from this evidence, and I'm not even sure you could get at this from survey evidence, that this is something that might need focus group work, but exactly what people are thinking of when they think of areas in this sense. So if you ask somebody about the difference between deprived and non-deprived areas, are they thinking very locally about their streets and neighbourhoods? Are they thinking about their local situation compared to a nearby town or city? And that probably varies actually depending on where you live, because your terms of reference will be very different. If you're in a large city, the pockets of deprivation you may see within a city will be very different to if you're in a town and you're looking towards a town and towards a city and comparing yourself with that. So I think there's some really interesting work to unpack this in terms of some focus group work, which would think about what meaningful boundaries are for people when we're talking about levelling up areas, and that's something that perhaps so far hasn't been very well understood, and people perhaps aren't thinking about levelling up in terms of big infrastructure projects that connect the northeast to London, although the northeast is actually connected quite well to London. I guess you have to go to the southwest to London, perhaps, to think about that. And I think there's some things to draw out of that could be really important. I also think that we need to bear in mind that a lot of this seems to be confirming evidence that we've got from other places, that what we're seeing is an increase in salience of these economic divides and economic issues rather than widespread change in attitudes. There have been changes in attitudes to inequalities. The evidence on that is very clear. And there's certainly been evidence on changes in terms of people's attitude to taxation and spending, sort of feeding into tomorrow's conversation, perhaps. But when we look at the trends in that data, that tends to be around a broader shift away from austerity since the 2017 election, rather than something that's been driven by the COVID crisis particularly. And of course, in that context, we have to bear in mind that that pattern of attitudes existed at the 2019 general election. So it's not necessarily the case that this is a simple read off of being in favour of more spending, being anti-austerity, automatically leading people to a different political party, perhaps. I think that's something else to bear in mind when we're talking about this. Finally, what the salience of all this might mean for the parties. So I thought about this. I think there's both positives and negatives, or opportunities and challenges for both parties when thinking about these issues. So for Labour and for Keir Starmer, perhaps some hope almost if economics keeps becoming more salient. And I've been saying for quite a long time that I thought that would happen. And so there is perhaps a hope there that would allow the Labour Party to unite some of their more left-leaning supporters. And you can see how they try to steer away from kind of cultural issues to do that. But I think there's also a danger there, in that we know that even when these attitudes existed in 2019, people that were concerned about inequality still voted Conservative. And actually, if the Conservatives are able to make a success, or make a perceived success, of their levelling up agenda, then that actually puts some difficult questions then for the Labour Party to answer, in terms of, well, what would you do differently? And if you're not going to do anything differently on economics, you're back to culture wars issues, and that then becomes a problem for them. On the other side of that coin, though, for the Conservatives and for Boris Johnson, a lot has been staked on the levelling up agenda, which is clearly resonating, but that also means that people will expect results. And what the Conservative Party have meant by levelling up may not be what other people have thought, what people voting for them have thought they meant by levelling up, in terms of who and where and what is levelled up. And so I think there is a danger there of a failure, not necessarily a failure to deliver in the terms they've set themselves, but a failure to deliver in the terms it's been understood more widely by people who moved to them in 2019. Final thought, though, is that when these things are highly salient, there are arguments to be won. So it means that if they're on the agenda, they're things you can talk about, they're things you can win arguments around. And I don't think we should necessarily see, although people's deeply held orientations to these questions don't change very rapidly, what they think of as being the most appropriate policy responses can, and those arguments are still there to be won. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paula. That's a great intro to the broader implications for this. And do think of questions as we're going through for in the audience. Having some great ones coming already. Do put them through, earlier the better, so we can sort out some questions for after the panel. Paul, your reflections.
Thanks very much, Bobby. Thanks, Paula. Really interesting work, and as Bobby said, a really important input into the review of inequalities that we're doing at the IFS with Angus Deaton, where we're really trying to understand not just what the levels of inequality are, but what it is about them that bother people and what it is about them that don't. And I think this really begins to dig under the surface of that. And I think one of the, the thing perhaps I take away from this most is that set of differences in people's attitudes and the way in which those are defined politically. The very big difference between the Conservative and Labour voters, and as you say, between Remain and Leave over some dimensions of it at least. Although it is worth saying that one of the charts from the report, Bobby, that you didn't present, where you ask about income levels generally, would you say the gap between those with high incomes and those with low incomes is too large or not? You do get big majorities of all of the groups saying that they think that the gaps between high and low incomes are too large. So there are some points of agreement there, as well as the significant points of disagreement. But I think the thing I found most interesting about the points of disagreement really was around this issue of personal responsibility as opposed to structural or societal determination, where you get that big difference between the Labour and Conservative voters. And I think something that's actually really very important for many social scientists to acknowledge, that there is a substantial majority group out there who possibly put more weight on personal responsibility than is often the case once one gets into these discussions about structural determinants of outcomes. And that remarkable statistic that half of people think that jobs lost in the pandemic were not, were essentially down to people's own responsibility rather than bad luck. So it's a very clearly, deeply ingrained feeling within people. And I think that probably relates to some of the things one finds about other sets of attitudes. And we know, for example, that inheritance tax is the most unpopular of all taxes. Now that's sometimes put down to the fact that people don't understand that it's only paid by a very small fraction of people. But I think it's probably also not unrelated to the fact that the majority of the population possibly just have different instincts on this than the majority of social scientists. And I think that's something that we as social scientists really do need to recognize when working on these sorts of issues. And I think the same is probably true when you've talked a lot about the salience of the levelling up agenda and the difference between more and less deprived areas. I mean, as you and Paula have both said, I think we need to understand a lot more about what people actually mean by that. The thing that we know is really different between more and less deprived areas is actually the people who live there. And this is one of the pieces of work we're doing, the Deaton Review. It is not on the whole the case that if you have a particular level of skill and education and you move from one bit of the country to another, you'll suddenly make yourself a lot better off or a lot worse off. The fact is that in somewhere like southwest London, a very large fraction of the population are very highly educated graduates, and in some other parts of the country, only very small fractions of the population are highly educated graduates. And that's the big difference actually between different areas of the country. It's really down to who lives there, and so how you deal with that it certainly goes way beyond big infrastructure projects. And then the last thing I'd say is that it's right at the bottom of your charts, Bobby, were concerns about health inequalities and concerns about generational inequalities. I'm not so surprised about the generational inequalities coming down near the bottom, despite the fact that this is clearly a significant issue. Partly because they're just not so obvious, I think, to people in everyday life, and partly, of course, because families are multi-generational. I think people think of themselves as part of multi-generational families. But I do find the lack of concern about health and mortality inequalities really quite surprising, given that is often quite salient. There are often quite a lot of coverage of differences in that, and given how we seem to be so keen, as it were, on the NHS and equality in health. But maybe it is that there isn't quite that sense of the degree of inequality. Maybe, again, it's down to a belief that this is very much personally driven rather than driven by external circumstances, despite, I have to say, most of the evidence to the contrary. And certainly my sense that health inequalities is it's the inequality that squeezes out at the end of all other inequalities. And is determined by those. So a lot of food for thought in all of that, and an awful lot to digest, both now and as I said at the beginning, we carry on with our review of policy, of the structure of inequalities and policy responses to them. But I think one of the things that this tells me is that we have to construct any whether one is a group of social scientists looking at this, or even more importantly, if one's a group of politicians trying to get elected. I think if one doesn't understand what it is that concerns people about inequality, then one can easily just hit a very bum note when it comes to talking about what to do about it.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. No, really useful. And I think that's exactly right. And as someone who's just finishing a book on generational differences, looking at inequalities, including across different generations, it was a bit disheartening to see people not picking up on that as a strong theme. But I think it's absolutely correct, and it does reflect that strength of connection as much as anything across generations as division. And I think that probably leads into Sundar Katwala, who, your thoughts on that?
Great, thanks, Bobby. Thanks for the introduction. I think I can do a little bit of what Paula and Paul were both saying we could do with here, which is to think a bit more about what's underlying these snapshots of attitudes and what's changed. British Future's a think tank that works a lot on different identity issues, but we've just conducted this exercise called Talk Together, which was published yesterday for the Together Coalition, which is a coalition looking at social connection. So a slightly different question from how we think about inequality, how do we think about division and unity of different kinds in our society. But that's involved a lot of conversations with people as well as polling research at a lot of scale. We've had about 150,000 people submit in terms of online surveys, but we've also had 500 people in Zoom-based online discussions. We'd have liked to travel the country, but on a national and regional and local basis, talking about what's going on. And the findings rather align quite a lot. In terms of social connection as opposed to inequality, people feel it got better during the pandemic year, despite all of the pain. At a level of well-being, at a level of personal satisfaction, people have had a pretty miserable year. But in terms of community, people feel that's gone strongly and well. By 2 to 1, they think it's brought out the unity more than the divisions. But that's a very local sentiment. That's about the local connection, and the national sense of connection has really been incredibly volatile. Started incredibly strongly. Everyone fell out last Easter over whether people were obeying the rules and what was going on among those in power. But that was very choppy as well in the second half of the year. Actually, the lowest point, speaking to this point about geographical inequalities, the lowest point in terms of national mood was October, when it very much felt that not just the pandemic, but the response to the pandemic was dividing the North from the South in a way that felt unfair to people. And that brought out a set of arguments, anger, grievances about regional equality that were actually much less there than at Christmas, when we had the new variant and we were back to having national policies. So that sensitivity to regional and local unfairness, and it's absolutely right to say that people are thinking in different ways about that. There's a lot of discussion about London and what people mean when they say about London, but there's also a lot of comparison, as Paula was saying, I think, between what's happening between Wigan and Manchester, or why it won't be fair to Dewsbury if everything goes to Huddersfield, is a very common kind of discussion about place-based inequality, and makes it rather hard actually to work out how to integrate all of that into levelling up. So my other reflection on this research that you've done is it's actually quite early, I think, and probably premature to have this discussion about has it changed us? Is there a sense? Because I think the academics and the think tankers and the NGOs want to get onto this what's next conversation. Can we build back better? Is there a sense of a new beverage? And people have been absorbing a lot of information about the way it makes us think about key workers or society, but actually our horizons narrowed a lot. And most people have not been having those conversations about what next. There's been an enormous crowding out effect. So when we've talked to people about what divides and unites us, it was quite hard to get people to move from who is socially distancing in the queue at the supermarket and who isn't, back to questions about Brexit and inequality and the United Kingdom that are very important to them, but that were just much, much less salient at the moment, because the question is, when will I not be homeschooling anymore, and can I get a haircut? And the question of what is fairness in our society, is going to really matter, but it hasn't happened yet. It hasn't started yet as a discussion. And so on these shifting sands of salience, I think the conversation is about to start in the future. I think what we have found is that there's a shift in the salience of divides between the rich and the poor and divides between areas, and that's now top in our research compared to Brexit, which will still be there, and what people thought about Brexit will affect the way they think about inequality, the way they think about meritocracy, the way they think about race, but in a complicated way. But that's now top. But we don't know what we're going to think about that because that conversation hasn't happened. I think people have had this experience of cohesion because we have been a much less polarized society than we've been telling ourselves during COVID. I mean, nobody's enjoyed lockdown, but we've agreed on it more than any other government policy in modern decades. We've actually all agreed about furloughing, even if we've got different views about government and the economy. We've almost all agreed about vaccines, even if we disagreed about lockdown. And so there's been this surprising discovery of things we share, which normally had been just the NHS. We all love the NHS, but we're going to tear each other's throats apart. Actually, under the pressure of a pandemic, we agree on quite a lot. We then don't agree on a lot of other things as we emerge from it, but we haven't started those debates yet. I just want to reflect a little bit on what you found about race, which I think is very interesting. Race has never been more salient in British society. Race is more salient than immigration in British society. That hasn't happened in the previous 20 years. That might have happened very briefly around the Stephen Lawrence affair, and it will grow in salience because a sixth of our society is not white, but it's a very uneven salience, as you picked up, and it divides not just left from right or Labour from Conservatives. It's a very different conversation in the cities and in the towns and out on the coast, and it's a very different conversation across the generations. There's just a very different centre of gravity among 30-year-olds across ethnic groups than there is among 60-year-olds. And it's quite interesting actually that, in a way, young white people and older ethnic minority people kind of cross over a bit in these debates. So what we found about that, very similar to your research, is that there's a quarter of the population, especially if you're young, not just if you're black, but if you're young, really, and especially if you've got a degree, where you're expecting this was an overdue, urgent call for action. And I mean, another half of the population agree about that, but want a conversation about the terms on which we do fairness and anti-racism. And you saw in those findings, there's a toxic racist fringe, much smaller than America, but the online debate we have about those issues feels very American. We actually get half of it from America, and we mix it up into this much more polarized American debate that then makes people feel it's very, very divisive. So I think, as Paul was saying there as well, this is a debate about meritocracy again, because actually people on different sides of this debate agree that we want meritocracy, but your view about class and your view about race depends on whether you think we've been in some progress, we're almost there, we haven't started, or whether we're now in a position of being too fair to some groups compared to others. And yet there's a shared idea there that we're trying to get to meritocracy and a disagreement about the state of the world that we're in. So I think it's incredibly helpful to have this snapshot, but rather than saying we haven't changed our views, I think the argument is it's very much up for grabs. And if we stop debating, when will lockdown end and when will the pandemic end, I think we're going to lose the two issues that have absolutely dominated our public conversation, which are COVID for the last year, Brexit for the 4 years before that. And actually there are some unwritten scripts, I think, as to how to engage these debates. I think the social inequalities debate always gets crowded out by the culture war clashes, yet people want to hear more about it. How do you crowd that debate in to our public conversation?
Excellent. Well, a great way to end. Thank you, Sunda. And that sets us up. I think, looking across the questions I've got, there's three key themes that seem to stand out, and it is around individualism, meritocracy, some of the further understanding that levelling up point and area-based, and then around race and how that fits in to economics and cultural perspectives. So I'm going to start with a question just from Tanya Burkhardt, who asks, how do you reconcile the data which we're interpreting as showing commitment to individualism on part of general public, or an underlying theme or belief in meritocracy, with the evidence of people's behaviour during the pandemic, and how, more or less as you've been describing, Cinder, how people came together around lots of things. Any reflections on this kind of apparent contradiction in how we view these economic things and how we've been acting in the pandemic? Something probably comes to you first.
So is that to me?
Yeah.
Yes, it's a good question. I think that the pandemic, people feel it should change our view of social relationships. It should change status. I personally think it's shifted the political media debate towards where the public already were on a lot of these issues in status, but the public's views about these issues about sort of social status, is it always the people with degrees who merit the most, or etc. That's been hard to get a hearing for. So I think that's what's shifted. The question of what happens about it when you're not under the pressure of a pandemic, I think, is the conversation that, as I say, hasn't really begun yet. And so people feel that it should see a shift, but they're also quite unsure if that will happen. Actually, we found there's a real sense of crossroads. A third of people think we've got quite used to being apart, so that will be more disconnected in that sense. Another third of people think, well, it's good to have this discussion, but let's face it, we all know we're going back to normal. And then there's another group that says, I don't want to go back to normal, and I don't want to see that. And whether that group can come through and build the kind of coalitions it needs is going to be difficult, because people agree on the unfairness, but they probably don't agree on the remedy to it, I think, is what comes out of your research.
Yeah. Paula, any reflections?
Some reflections. I'm not sure they answered the question very well, but one thing that kind of came to me while Sundar was talking in relation to that question was actually there is still going to be space in a few months or maybe a year's time to talk about those ideas of merit, in particular around this, this kind of almost new idea of a key worker that didn't really exist until somebody had to define it for schooling purposes. And so actually there are all sorts of very low paid occupations that fall into those categories now. We've talked a lot about public service and NHS, but there's actually a lot of low paid occupations in the private sector that also fall into those groups. I'm thinking here about supermarkets, food delivery drivers, those kinds of occupations that many of us have relied heavily on, that are very low paid, and that ought to feed into these debates about meritocracy moving forward. I think there's also, though, the potential for a kind of new divide, which broadly maps onto the degree, not degree divide, if I can use that sort of horrible shorthand for a moment, which is those of us who are able, as we are all able, to work from home, and those of who've had to leave the house every day throughout a pandemic in order to go to work, even if they're not necessarily defined as key workers per se, haven't been able to work from home. And that's a kind of new divide and a new inequality that we haven't really talked about. And at the start of the pandemic and over recent, there was this, we're all in it together, we're all experiencing the same pandemic, but we really haven't all been experiencing the same pandemic at all. And I think some of those dividing lines about how the pandemic and work and home have been experienced have still to play out over time.
Thank you, Paula. Paul?
Not an enormous amount to add to that. I mean, in terms of your question or Tanya's question, I think people are able to hold different views at the same time, I think, which might appear contradictory but really aren't necessarily. So I think there can easily be a sense of social solidarity, particularly during the sorts of times that we're going through at the moment, and a belief in certain sets of public services, as well as a belief in an individual responsibility. And I don't think those are necessarily contradictory. And even if they are, I think it's not too hard to hold them together at the same time. I think actually how people see where we come out of this and what how it comes about, I think is going to be very important to politics going forward. By which I mean, I think it is likely that we will see some increased inequalities as a result of the last year. I mean, we know that the young have done very badly relative to the older groups. And we know in particular that poorer children at school have suffered much more than better off children at school, both because of the ways they've been supported at home and by schools, and that could have very long-term consequences for inequalities. And we know that in the labour market, I mean, there really is this huge graduate, non-graduate divide there. You know, at the end of December, there were no fewer graduates working than there were a year before, and there were a very large number fewer non-graduates working than there were a year before. So these are, you know, these are sort of, as it were, evidently you know, acts of God, as it were, rather than acts of individual responsibility, which will have long-term consequences. And I think, you know, in a sense, it will be easy to lose that in future discussions. And I think actually being clear about the extent to which, if they have, things have shifted, will be terribly important. And the last thing I'd just like to say on reflection on this is, you know, I think all of this is made much more difficult, and very obviously, in a sense, by the fact that we've had a decade without income growth across the distribution, and that's bound to make people, you know, less you know, content with their lot. So the issue with whether you define them as key workers or other low-paid workers is they're, broadly speaking, paid the same and often less than they were a decade ago. And that's a very different world to the world we were in a decade ago, when incomes have been rising at a reasonable pace across most of the distribution. And that, you know, that has political consequences as well as the obvious economic consequences shown through in, you know, voting patterns, you know, in referendums and elections.
Great. Thank you, Paul. So just let's pick up on the theme of levelling up, because it's coming across in lots of the different questions. And there's a sort of the three parts to the things that I can see across the questions is first of all, do people know what it means? As in, do the public understand it as a term and recognise it? Is it getting cut through? So it's quite a sort of political question in some ways, is it, from a campaign point of view? Then there's the more substantive point I think that we've been kind of touching on is, what are people thinking of? What, regardless of the term, what does this area-based focus actually mean to people? And then, so that relates then to what we should do, our thoughts on what we should do. And then I guess there's an element within that, what should we do, is can we do anything about it? Just as someone who's worked on area-based initiatives for 20 years, the difficulty of actually shifting these things in a meaningful way is very high. So understanding what actually is the response to that. So do people understand what it means? What really does it mean in terms of what are people thinking of, and can it be addressed? Is it possible to address it? Maybe we come to you first, Paula, on these.
So if I take the kind of first question about cut through, I think if you actually ask people, you know, do you know what levelling up means? I've seen one or two focus groups that do this. You're not going to get very well worked out answers, in the same way that you don't for most of these big kind of political ideas. I suspect you could go back 15 years and ask similar questions about big society, for example. People don't know what these things mean, but they have some sense of having been promised something. And that's where I think there's the danger for the Conservative Party in particular, that as they keep pushing this and becoming associated with it, without people really latching onto exactly what they mean, people will fill it with what they want to get better, rather than what the Conservatives are necessarily saying will get better. And I think that's where the danger lies, is that what people want to get better is not necessarily going to be the same thing as what actually gets better. I think another thing that we haven't had a chance to kind of see where this is going to end up and think through in terms of this is the way that the pandemic is going to have reshaped towns and cities and high streets. And also I was talking to my children the other day about various things that aren't going to be there when we can next go back into the town centre that were there before, that have disappeared without us noticing because we've all been locked down. And so I think what town centres are going to look like, what high streets are going to look like, what local areas are going to look like is still quite uncertain. But people are coming away now with a sense that, you know, the Conservatives said they're going to level up, they're going to make our area better. And I think that is what will stick, and gives that danger to them if they don't manage to do that.
Oh.
Well, if people do know what levelling up means, they know more than I do, that's for sure. And frankly, speaking to senior civil servants, they also know more than the people who are supposed to be implementing it. No, I mean, I think it's a very clever slogan with very little clarity behind it. And, you know, but you can see from your results that that's something that can work given people's concerns. I mean, I'll go back in a sense to what I was saying in my initial response to your remarks, is that, you know, the big difference, if you're looking at, you know, broader areas or indeed very local areas, is it's bluntly among the people who live there. You know, rich areas are where high income people live. High income people are people on the whole with a particular kind of education. Now, there's one sort of slight outlier to that, which is that if you know, there's only one place really where the super rich live, and that's London and it around, and one or two kind of spots where in other parts of the country. But broadly speaking, it's very much down to you know, where people, you know, the people who live in particular areas, and that of course reflects where the jobs are, that people with those kinds of skills and qualifications can live and be employed. And that takes you to your sort of last question really, which is, well, what do you do about that? Well, it's an incredibly difficult and long-term issue about where people are and where the jobs are that people want to be employed in, and it's not something that's going to be fixed by building houses, roads, railway lines, or whatever, although each of those may provide some help. What it is going, you know, what it can be helped by in the long run is at least as much softer issues, schooling, further education, attractive places for businesses to locate, attractive places for people to locate. And I suppose the last point, and you know, I don't know if people have read Chris Giles in the Financial Times this morning, but it's an extreme, I really would recommend anyone who wants to really understand about regional inequalities to read his piece there, which really does, you know, focus on the fact that if you're just looking at incomes, average median incomes in London are no higher than median incomes anywhere else in the country, once you take account of housing costs. But, you know, as I say, London's where all the very high income people are, but it's also related to, you know, one of the geographic impacts of the COVID crisis, which is that, you know, if you want to know which labour market has suffered worse, well, it's London, 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 and London. It's suffered far worse than any other labour market in the country, because we do have a very large number of low-paid, low-skilled people working in hospitality, tourism, retail, entertainment, and so on in London. And actually, you know, the big inequalities in many senses are within regions. So that, as I say, then gets down to this issue of, you know, how local is local when people are thinking about inequalities.
Great. Yes, Sundar.
People don't know this term, levelling up. I've asked it recently. About a third of people think they know what we're talking about when we use it. They're definitely talking about the same thing, but they're not using the term. It did a bit worse than terms like institutional racism and BAME when I looked at it. And, you know, the knowledge of those is quite patchy as well. So that is a policy language, but people know about the debate. That is a challenge for putting these issues on the agenda, because the discussion is so often so abstract. I think people have very clear views about some tangible things. They have strong views about food banks and what that means for our society. They have strong views about online retailers and whether they should pay taxes if they're going to do very well in a pandemic, and at different times have strong views about bankers and certain types of elites, and everything else about this conversation is very fuzzy. And so you have a debate that is about the very bottom and the very top, but it's quite hard to knit it together. And I think that is the challenge if you're not interested in just the very, very top and you know, the margins and people having it toughest, then sort of finding ways to tell stories that make sense to people outside of this jargon is important. I think the class versus race debate is really problematic there. It gets difficult. There's a use of class to block debates about race, to say you're talking about race, but what about class? And you say, great, let's talk about class as well. And people stop once they've blocked the race debate. Now, if you make your race debate points in the language of white privilege, you're asking to get stuck there. But unsticking that is quite challenging. But I think what this new research captures is a real challenge shared by people interested in racial inequality, geographical inequality, class inequality, which is if you go equality versus meritocracy, then you've got a market on the left, but you're probably not going to broaden it. If you could try and get hold of the people who believe in meritocracy and effort and talk about the barriers to it, in terms of class, in terms of race, you potentially could go a bit broader. It's quite hard, I think, for civic society, academia, maybe the left of politics to do that, because the instinct is kind of equality, not meritocracy. Meritocracy is a myth. But actually, I think these findings show that you go through people's desire to have fairness and equal opportunity and try and connect with their common sense views about why that isn't the world they live in yet.
Great, thank you. Just picking up on that sentence, I want to circle back to the kind of levelling up in area-based and views of the future just before we finish from someone's question. But just on that one question that we have had is, what do the panel think could be underlying those views that we saw of Black people's lack of motivation being a bigger explanation for some groups within the country than others, and that structural point? What do you think underlies that, Sundar, before we go to a more general question?
Well, you're seeing that, which I think is common with the research we've been doing. We're publishing new research on race in the next month or so. But yes, it's over-amplified online. There's a group that is just overtly racist and also sort of covertly racist, but still quite racist. But it's a much narrower group in Britain than it is in America. And you don't need that group to have a 66%, 70% coalition for fairness across race and class. So if you're always going for that group, I think, you know, you want to put them in a box, you want to get them to behave well online or on social public transport, but you don't need to get to that group to deal with this fairness tension that people feel between a belief in merit and effort, a knowledge that it isn't fair for everybody, it does depend on who you know, but a sense that getting that right on class, getting that right on race is complicated and different. So I think you can get to the middle with people who have these views about meritocracy without needing the people who have, you know, right, stereotypical biological racism, you know, explanations about Black people.
Yeah, that's really useful to bring out and backed up by the research that we've got here. So just some final thoughts, just a quick reflection from me on the area-based point is I saw Julian McRae from Engage Britain tweeting this morning about their research on similar things that shows that that area focus is a real mix of London versus the rest, north versus south, those big geographical things, and very local based concerns, as we're saying. And I think that's really important to hold on to and to explore more. Again, as someone who was involved a lot in New Deal for communities and neighbourhood renewal, all of those types of aspects, it does matter to people. And I think it is about the people in the places, but it is also a place-based element to it as well. It is having areas that are thriving affects more than the people who live there, affects people around it, and the feeling of a place, of a broader city or town or area more generally. And I think that's really important to hold on to and to think about what are we doing for those very local communities, not just a simplistic rebalancing between regions. And I think that is one of the themes that I would take from this and things that would be good to understand more on. But it leads to the final question. There's Louise Casey, who was raising some of those points about what we did in the late 90s and 2000s. And her point is very simple, just to go around the panel as your final thoughts is, do you feel optimistic about the years ahead? To each of you. Very good question. Paula, should we go to you first and do it in order? On this issue of inequalities and how we
On
deal
this particular issue of inequalities, I think at the moment I don't feel desperately optimistic, because the evidence so far suggests that what's happening is people are concerned but still in their own set of values. So they're not, it's not driving a desire for radical renewal. But I think that could just be a short to medium term thing. So I think at the moment it's really difficult to ask people if they want to see radical change, when actually what people want most of all is their lives back. So actually, I think this is a question for the longer term, and hopefully the kind of optimistic side is that there might be a space to have that conversation. But I don't think now is the time when everybody just desperately wants normal.
Yes. Paul.
Well, I certainly desperately want normal, and I'm afraid it's not my normal way to be optimistic. But I think I think there are lots of reasons to be pessimistic because of what's happened over the last, not just the last year, but the last 10 years and more. The lack of income growth over a long period, and then with this sort of double whammy of the disequalizing effect of the last year is pretty bad news. But it is the sort of thing which can result in a change in priorities and a change in people's perceptions. But I think it is something we're just going to have to wait and see.
Okay, Sunda.
It's rational, I think, with Paul's evidence to be pessimistic about the short-term impacts. But what you get from those impacts is you get a greater salience of these issues that has been missing. And so it depends how you use that. I do think this crowding out effect, we've talked about nothing but COVID, but we were very stuck in the Brexit debate as well for 4 or 5 years. There is a blank period, the kaleidoscope does shift, and we could be having exactly the same debates in 2 or 3 years' time that we were having 5 years ago, but that would be our failure if we do that. So I think people should be optimistic about their attempt to get a hearing for new arguments in this period as when we get our lives back, because people don't, I think, want exactly the same debates that we've been having.
Excellent. What a great point to end on. Thank you. And thank you for all the contributions to that. So just, we've run 1 minute over, but we've done not too bad. So just for me to thank, first of all, the Policy Institute team for putting all this together, to our colleagues at UK and Changing Europe and the IFS Eaton Review for support on the study alongside Nuffield Foundation. And to the audience for coming over lunch and staying with us. And of course, finally to our panel, thank you very much for brilliant contributions. And do look out for the report if you haven't seen it yet, and have a good read. Thank you for joining us today. Bye.